This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. We are talking about Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty, an essay from 1969. Wes, you picked this. Why did you pick this?
We haven't done Isaiah Berlin on the Partially Examined Life. I've wanted to do him for a long time. I know, I don't know a lot. I know a little bit about him. And he's a political philosopher I've long wanted to read. And I was looking at options. I was looking at ideas for readings we should do. And I saw this essay and it reminded me that this is something I'd long wanted to do. And it's short, so it makes sense. But yeah, by the way, we should solicit this from listeners. Send us, if you have suggestions for readings, let us know. What email address are we using?
Ask me that when I've prepared. We used to know. It'll be somewhere on the blog post. You can always do PL at partiallyexaminedlife.com, but I forget what the other ones that we've set up are.
All right.
Because no one's ever used them to this point.
Yeah.
We encourage folks to go to the Patreon site, and you can message us through Patreon. Even if you're just following us as a free follower, you can message us through that. So that's one way.
Okay.
All right, let me just start. Two Concepts of Liberty, Part 1. To coerce a man is to deprive him of freedom. Freedom from what? Almost every moralist in human history has praised freedom. Like happiness and goodness, like nature and reality, the meaning of this term is so porous that there is little interpretation that it seems to be able to resist. I do not propose to discuss either the history or the more than 200 senses of this protean word recorded by historians of ideas. 200, okay. I propose to examine no more than two of the senses, but those central ones with a great deal of human history behind them, and I dare say still to come. The first of these political senses of freedom or liberty, I shall use both words to mean the same, which, following much precedent, I shall call the negative sense, is involved in the answer to the question, what is the area within which the subject, a person or group of persons, is or should be left to do or be what he is able to do or be, without interference by other persons. The second, which I shall call the positive sense, is involved in the answer to the question, what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that? The two questions are clearly different, even though the answers to them may overlap. So the negative sounds very familiar, but this formulation of the positive is a little different than I've heard. What or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be this rather than that?
This reminds me of Mill, because Mill in On Liberty, strangely enough, talks about any freedom as correlating to control or interference. So, in other words, we associate freedom with rights. So if it's my right not to be attacked in the street randomly, then you can't do that. And the government's allowed to put you in jail if you do. So according to Mill, every freedom that we might have in a society corresponds to a coercion of another person at a different level. I think this is why some of these discussions today are that we see in more popular media are ill-conceived. They inevitably leave out this idea that freedom is always, in a political sense, is always correlated to coercion.
Right. So you could say that freedom and responsibility are tied, though it's not necessarily the responsibility of the individual. This is not the Spider-Man thing. that if you have a freedom, you have a responsibility. It's someone has a responsibility to enforce that freedom, to keep others from abridging that freedom.
But not only that, right? So yes, we have the governmental authority to do that. But if I have a freedom you have a loss of freedom. You're not allowed to attack me in the street as much as I know you would love to. You're not allowed to do that, and the government is going to force you not to do that. So,
I mean, I don't know. I don't think that's really relevant to the two senses that he's putting here. The positive one. So what I understood the positive one to be in all my other is just power. If I have the freedom to vote, that means I have the power to vote. If I have the freedom to move my arms, that means I have the power to move my arms. It also means no one is restraining me from moving my arms. It also means that no one is keeping me from voting. And more than that, if we conceive of political positive freedoms in this way, that means that the responsibility of the government to set up voting apparatus and do all this stuff to enable me. So you could say, I have a freedom to not starve. In other words, I have certainly not starving, not being beset by hunger. Like being beset by hunger is a serious impingement on my freedom. So you want to say, to be truly free, we have to have a certain level of power so that we're not held down by the forces of hunger or other sorts of oppression. But that one, very straightforwardly, that means, okay, somebody has to feed me, or, there have to be resources that I can gather for myself somehow or another. If this is an absolute unabridgable life, right, then even if I can't move at all, if I'm a completely paralyzed, or just am too lazy, I don't feel like moving, then, I guess maybe I'm just not taking advantage of my freedom. I was saying that, if I have the right to vote, I have the freedom to vote, the power to vote. I don't know. Do you even like that equation of the positive sense of freedom with right or power?
I'm not following you there. I mean, I think you're bringing up an interesting point, which is, often comes into discussions these days, which is that there are sort of social grounds to the exercise of a freedom. Mm-hmm. So I might nominally have the freedom to do this or that, to vote or to start a business or to do, any number of things within society, freedom of speech. But if the social grounds, right, disadvantage me, it could be because I'm a minority or something like that. If this, so if, I might have freedom of speech, but if certain opinions are so out of bounds socially, that doesn't matter. This is one of Mill's points. If social coercion and conformity reach such extreme levels, my political freedom becomes irrelevant. But or not entirely irrelevant, but it's compromised. In this case, so I'm not sure what you're saying is. I mean, I think we're going to find out, but you're taking. I think we both agree on negative freedom. It's just the freedom to do what we want, right, within reason. So it's not freedom to kill other people on a whim. It certainly is curtailed, but it's within a certain framework. It's a freedom to do what we want. And then the second I took to be the coercion involved in ensuring freedoms within society. I'm not sure what you're taking it to be yet.
I mean, I was giving sort of my understanding prior to this paper of positive freedom. His again, what or who is the source of control or interference that can determine someone to do or be something. So the causal, if we're talking Aristotle's causes, the efficient cause, it sounds like, of an action is a form of positive freedom, which just seems a very weird thing to do, to say, I shoot a billiard ball at another billiard ball, and the first one is somehow the freedom because it is determining, like, this just seems ass backwards. Why would this be a conception of freedom at all? So yeah, we have to.
Yeah, so let's find out.
But unfortunately, the next section is on negative freedom. So go ahead and read that, Wes.
Damn, we're probably not going to find out in this episode. Stay tuned. This is the reason to keep listening to them. All right, the notion of negative freedom. I am normally said to be free to the degree to which no man or body of men interferes with my activity. Political liberty in this sense is simply the area within which a man can act unobstructed by others. If I am prevented from doing what I could otherwise do, I am to that degree unfree. And if this area is contracted by other men beyond a certain minimum, I can be described as being coerced, or it may be enslaved. Coercion is not, however, a term that covers every form of inability. Okay, this might be getting at the thing that I think you brought up already. If I say that I am unable to jump more than 10 feet in the air, or cannot read because I'm blind, or cannot understand the darker pages of Hegel, I love that, the darker pages of Hegel, it would be eccentric to say that I am to that degree enslaved or coerced. Coercion implies the deliberate interference of other human beings within the area in which I could otherwise act. You lack political liberty or freedom only if you're prevented from attaining a goal by human beings.
Can we stop there for a second?
Sure.
So, yeah, what do we think? I understand, okay, we're giving a definition of coercion for political purposes, but wouldn't we want to say ordinarily, like, if circumstances can coerce you to a particular path, right? Extreme famine. My ability to choose is restricted by the circumstance. I must go toward the food. I must flee the area that is beset by famine. Something that's not coercion according to this. I mean, is that just okay? So let's let him define his terms however he wants, but it's still just as important, it seems like, if we're going to talk about political freedom and what people's real abilities to do anything are. That if you are, you have the right to vote again, but we haven't given any sort of accommodations for people with disabilities, then you literally, no one is preventing you. No one was scheming, we're going to keep those wheelchair people from getting to the polls. But if you happen to set the poll up in a place that has steep stairs and no elevator and no ramp, then nobody devised that, but yet you are being prevented. You're being coerced sounds toward a particular goal, whereas this is merely prevented from doing something. Is this not a form of coercion?
Right. And of course, I think there are many on the progressive left who would object to this characterization of freedom, and they see it as associated with classical liberalism, and I think it's something they think needs to be supplemented. So that's kind of what the example I was trying to bring up. But I think for instance, if it's one thing to say we have the freedom to do something and that the government is not going to interfere, or that other human beings are not going to actively, physically interfere or with my actions or pass laws against my actions. But social coercion is really important. What about the norms of a society? What about the norms people are internalizing? In other words, we go back to Foucault and discourse and the way in which discourse constructs identities. We are very much coerced by our social influences, such that one might think that ensuring freedom really ensures changing all these structural problems, changing from on high, changing the culture, making sure that certain norms rather than others hold, right? So if the norm in society is a racist norm, even if it's not instantiated in institutions, in laws, if it's there socially, it becomes a huge impediment to the exercise of freedom. So I think that's a kind of critique that people would make today. I mean, I think you're also, your wheelchair ramp is also, another example of that kind. I think these are very difficult cases. Obviously, I'm critical of the in many ways of these sorts of structural accounts, and but it's important to take them into account. I think he may get there. I don't know. But I think what we're pointing to is this idea of interference by other human beings is still vague. What does that mean? Does it mean explicit interference through law or physical restraint, or could it be more subtle? Could it be social coercion?
So if people, regardless of ethnicity or sexual orientation, are free to be in public buildings and businesses that are open to the public, then is it the case? I'm trying to get at what your this more subtle form of coercion. Clearly, if the people running the place, a restaurant, say, just do not like the minority that comes in and give off hostility, give poor service, etc. Well, that's not coercion exactly, but it certainly is a disincentive. Is that what you were referring to, or are you referring to
No,
more fundamental
well,
structural things?
yeah, more fundamental. That might be included, but it could be the case. So this is like the white privilege episode, right? It could just be the case that society, that I know that if I walk into a certain department store, if I'm black, people might look at me a certain way. They might follow me around. I might get eyed by the security guard more. It makes me uncomfortable. And so I'm less likely to go into that department store. So nominally, I have the freedom to do that, just like everyone else. No one's going to prevent me. No one's going to say, you're not allowed in here. But I feel uncomfortable. Therefore, my freedom is restricted. I mean, I think your example is good too, but I'm saying it could be as subtle as one likes. And we have to take those arguments seriously and ask how we deal with that. So I'm all for taking those, as critical as I am of the way these ideas are deployed today. I'm all for taking them seriously. I don't think you can think about the concept of liberty without doing that. So, all right, shall I continue?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mere incapacity to attain a goal is not lack of political freedom. This is brought out by the use of such modern expressions as economic freedom and its counterpart, economic slavery. It is argued very plausibly that if a man is too poor to afford something on which there is no legal ban, a loaf of bread, a journey around the world, recourse to the law courts, he is as little free to have it as he would be if it were forbidden him by law. So this is in the realm of the thing we were anticipating.
Mm-hmm.
If my poverty were a kind of disease which prevented me from buying bread or paying for the journey around the world or getting my case heard, as lameness prevents me from running, this inability would not naturally be described as lack of freedom, least of all political freedom. It is only because I believe that my inability to get a given thing is due to the fact that other human beings have made arrangements whereby I am, whereas others are not, prevented from having enough money with which to pay for it, that I think myself a victim of coercion or slavery. In other words, this use of the term depends on a particular social and economic theory about the causes of my poverty or weakness. If my lack of material means is due to my lack of mental or physical capacity, then I begin to speak of being deprived of freedom and not simply about poverty, only if I accept the theory. We just stopped there. Which theory is he talking about?
He hasn't really made it clear, but a theory that there are pernicious forces at work that are purposefully, right? He's just defined coercion as purposeful action by people. So if you know about wheelchairs, you know there's the law about that, and yet you insist on building your buildings to exclude those people because purposefully you know that the disabled are more likely to vote in a way that I don't want them to vote, and so therefore it is on the theory that people are doing this purposefully, then this person is being deprived of a freedom, but not otherwise. If it's merely a natural incapacity, I'm not sure how to draw this line, but I think that's the line he's drawing. Does that seem right to you?
I'm just looking at this particular sentence. I just think, so in other words, the use of the term freedom depends on a particular social and economic theory about the causes of my poverty. What I think he's pointing to when we talk about poverty is that because of, if I'm a Marxian Is it because of essentially unjust class relation or something like that? There's some nefarious power at work, and I could call that a curtailment of my liberty. Or is it just an accidental byproduct of a capitalist society? Some people have more natural talents than others and are going to rise to the top, and others don't, and blah, blah, blah. So I think that might be the distinction here. If my lack of material means is due to my lack of mental or physical capacity, then I speak of being deprived of freedom only if I accept the theory. I think only if I accept like a Marxist type of theory, or a theory which incorporates that. Anyway, I think this sort of thing, a natural inequality, is very important to bring up, and it's part of the philosophical tradition for obvious reasons. We speak of political equality. We think it's something we can equalize between people, but we can't, as a society, do anything about the fact that some people are more intelligent than others, are more talented, that some people will rise to the top of organizations and fields and others won't. And that type of inequality is ineradicable. And I think sometimes today people act as if it is eradicable. They act as if society won't be stratified in that way, when it will be. Not everyone's going to be a film star or concert pianist, and not everyone is even going to be in management. And there's not much we can do about that, just because of the number of people in the world and the way those things are going to stratify. But I think some of what bothers me about politics today is they pretend, through the equalization of groups, that there's almost a fantasy that individuals there's going to be equality between individuals. This is part of what bothered me about Sandel, the meritocracy episode we did with Sandel, where equalization of status becomes and representation becomes an important aspect. It doesn't change the fact of natural inequality. Nothing is going to change that fact. So even if we had a communist society in which everyone had as many material resources as everyone else, wouldn't change the fact of differing statuses based on differing natural abilities. Some people are more beautiful than others. Some people are smarter, all of that stuff. And that's sort of the tragedy of social life that I think we have to look in the face when we're talking about this stuff.
Well, the fact that total equality is neither possible nor desirable. What is the name of the short story? Is it by Vonnegut, where to equalize everybody? Harrison Bergeron, is that right?
Oh, I haven't read that, but yeah.
Oh yeah, this is just often
cut off people's legs, or
yeah, if you're smarter, then we're gonna put some headphones on you that will jabber at you and distract you and make you effectively not smart. This is just supposed to show that complete equality is nonsense. But the fact that he says it is argued very plausibly that if a man is too poor to afford something on which there is no legal ban, a loaf of bread, a journey around the world, recourse to the law courts, he is as little free to have it as he would if it were forbidden him by law. But he's not going to then lump all these three types of things. Those three examples are very different by design, because we actually do regard the lack of some of them, recourse to law courts in particular, as a real abridgment of liberty. So saying, well, ultimate freedom is not possible, or ultimate equality is not possible, so let's not bother. I mean, I don't think Sandel was arguing that. I think he was arguing that there's some kind of equality that are too important socially that we really should do something about. Of course, it's not, so I think somebody taking that position is not going to be very swayed by the Harrison Bergeron, the complete, there's always going to be differences in natural ability. They're going to say, so what? Why should we let those differences affect what is really important about human life? And so then, it's a shifting, culturally specific, I think, decision of what constitutes a really important thing about human life. A trip around the world seems like, by definition, an extravagance. Nobody really needs that. But you could imagine, the internet is essentially a trip around the world. And when Al Gore was starting to argue, we have to have high-speed internet in rural areas, and I remember a friend of mine saying, no, that's ridiculous. That's just a luxury. And who would consider that a luxury now? So I think these things, some of them, there's a very strong, like recourse to
Right.
the law. A loaf of bread, nutrition specifically, that seems, if not legally, biologically so necessary. But I'm willing to accept the if he wants to make distinctions, to say, not, if everybody is starving, are we being oppressed? Are we necessarily being oppressed? Did we lose political freedom? Or maybe, we just were hit with a tsunami and all our food was wiped out. And yes, maybe some rich people are still not starving because they had access to excess stuff, but we wouldn't necessarily, and we might be mad about that, but we wouldn't necessarily say it is coercion or, an abridgment of my political freedom that I'm starving right now. So it's not, it just means that there are more ways of gauging the value of something than merely, is it politically free or not?
Well, I think, right. So there's a number of things there. We should distinguish natural inequality in natural abilities from something like economic deprivation that prevents one from accessing law courts. And perhaps I don't know what he's going to argue here. Perhaps it's the case that we do have to have a safety net, enough of a welfare society that everyone can actually exercise their freedoms, that they don't really have them if they don't have the means to exercise them. I don't know if he's going to argue that or not. But yeah, why don't I finish out this paragraph? And then, if in addition, I believe that I am being kept in want by a specific arrangement, which I consider unjust or unfair, I speak of economic slavery or oppression. The nature of things does not madden us, only ill will does, said Rousseau. The criterion of oppression is the part that I believe to be played by other human beings, directly or indirectly, with or without the intention of doing so, in frustrating my wishes. Okay, so intention is not required.
Mm-hmm.
By being free in this sense, I mean not being interfered with by others. The wider the area of non-interference, the wider my freedom. All right, I'll hand it off to you.
This is what the classical English political philosophers meant when they used this word. They disagreed about how wide the area could or should be. They supposed that it could not, as things were, be unlimited, because if it were, it would entail a state in which all men could boundlessly interfere with all other men. And this kind of natural freedom would lead to social chaos, in which men's minimum needs would not be satisfied, or else the liberties of the weak would be suppressed by the strong. So Hobbes actually talks about, we have this fundamental freedom, which we then give up, which seems in the context of Leviathan to be weird, that freedom is only a thing that is carved out by, and protected by society, as you were just saying, that society has to keep other people. But Hobbes wanted to say, from the very start, we start with freedom before there's even a state. So that seems a little backwards. But this seems to be what he's referring to. They supposed it could not be unlimited. It would entail a state in which all men could boundlessly interfere with all other men. This kind of natural freedom would lead to social chaos in which men's minimum needs would not be satisfied, or else the liberties of the weak would be suppressed by the strong. Here we continue. Because they perceive that human purposes and activities do not automatically harmonize with one another, and because, whatever their official doctrines, they put high value on other goals such as justice or happiness or culture or security or varying degrees of equality, they were prepared to curtail freedom in the interests of other values, and indeed of freedom itself. For without this, it was impossible to create the kind of association that they thought desirable. Consequently, it is assumed by these thinkers that the area of men's free action must be limited by law. But equally it is assumed, especially by such libertarians as Locke and Mill in England and Constant and Tocqueville in France, that there ought to exist a certain minimum area of personal freedom which must on no account be violated. For if it is overstepped, the individual will find himself in an area too narrow for even that minimum development of his natural faculties, which alone makes it possible to pursue and even to conceive the various ends which men hold good or right or sacred. It follows that a frontier must be drawn between the area of private life and that of public authority. Where it is to be drawn, is a matter of argument, indeed of haggling. Men are largely interdependent, and no man's activity is so completely private as never to obstruct the lives of others in any way. Freedom for the pike is death for the minnows. The liberty of some must depend on the restraint of others. Freedom for an Oxford Don, freedom for an Oxford Don, others have been known to add, is a very different thing from freedom for an Egyptian peasant.
Yeah. So I think we've seen a lot of this before. I think in our Tocqueville live show, I think my teaser for that was, is equality and freedom consistent with one another? They come into conflict in the society. Society is built in part to ensure varying degrees of equality. But for Mill, right, we do have these utilitarian values at work, and flourishing is one of them, the flourishing of a society, the flourishing of the individual. But that itself is not possible without a certain minimal degree of freedom. So I have to have the freedom, for instance, to live the kind of life I want, right? And to pursue what I want to pursue, whether it's in my romantic life, or in my professional life, or whatever. So Mill will try to connect these two ideas, these, utilitarianism and a more rights-based conception of what a society should be.
These quotes are interesting, that I think that he says he's interpreting freedom for the pike is death for the minnows as the liberty of some must depend on the restraint of others. It occurs to me more like I should be free to start a company and churn out all this pollution, right? The stuff is just here. I'm abrogating the natural resources. I'm doing what is within my rights. And if that makes you choke because I am spewing things into the air, tough for you. So the minnows are not members of the moral community, but you as the breathing public are members of the moral community. So this is a thing that is at least argued over, that how much freedom should we give businesses versus how much freedom from their byproducts.
I think he's just making the same point that Mill and others have made, which is that every form of freedom depends on coercion. So the pike is not allowed to, so to speak, go around doing what it wants to all the minnows. In order to ensure the rights of the minnows, I have to restrict what the pike does. That's Mill's point. In order for anyone to have any rights, and it's Hobbes, as you mentioned, in order for anyone to have any rights, the government must be involved in restraint and coercion. It must prevent you, or have a law against you killing me, for instance, on a whim. There's got to be laws to punish that, right? So there's lots and lots and lots of coercion in a society, both social and governmental, and in fact, freedom and rights do not exist without that coercion. They're two sides of the same coin.
So here's my problem with, I was misreading the word pike as not another kind of fish, but as like the stabby spear. So if you're a spear fisherman, then the freedom of your pikes, I should have the freedom to use my pike however I want. But that means some minnows are going to die. That's just too bad.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a different point being made, that we don't want the freedom of the pike if the pike is the predatory freshwater fish. We want to restrain them. Yep. But how does that relate to freedom for an Oxford Don, others have been known to add, is a very different thing from freedom for an Egyptian peasant.
Yeah, very different example, right? That doesn't seem to be an example in which there's some correlation between freedom and coercion. It's not like coercion is necessary for on the Oxford Don in order to ensure freedom for the Egyptian peasant. So this example seems to be more about the inequality of conditions, which is the way
Mm-hmm.
Tocqueville put it, right? The way in which inequality of conditions can interfere with the scope of one's freedom. So everyone has the freedom to walk into a restaurant in a way, but the Oxford Don has, has the money to do it, and the Egyptian peasant does not. Everyone has the freedom. I think this is maybe more apt. Everyone has the freedom to sit down with a book and read and think and try to live the life of the mind and engage in what Aristotle thought was the key to happiness, which is contemplation. The Egyptian peasant nominally has that freedom, but really they just have to work all the time.
See, I thought the contrast was between two different environments, because it's not like the Oxford Don. It's not like the prince and the pauper within the same society. That you could make that point that you were just making, but to say in the world of an Egyptian peasant, things are much different than in the world of an Oxford Don. And so how much do you have to push down those people to enable the freedom of their surroundings? And likewise, the people that they have to deal with, how much do those people have to be put down to give them enough freedom that it's at least a very different calculation? I think this is closer to my, if everybody is starving, then different things are required, right? You might have to, in the post-apocalyptic worlds of The Walking Dead, for instance, if you don't work, you don't eat. In fact, it's so much effort to build our little shelters that if you are not constantly manning the ramparts and keeping the zombies away, then you are positively a drain, and we should just push you over the edge of the wall and let you die. Whereas in any civilized place, then that kind of restriction on your behavior would not be necessary. You could have the freedom to read a book, for instance, whereas in the Walking Dead world, no just sitting around and reading books. Get back to the wall.
You're making me think of the Great Leap Forward with Mao in China, where they deprived the peasants of all their land, and then they said, you have to come to the central canteen to eat if you want food. You're not allowed to till the land anymore and make your own food. You're going to rely on us, but you're not allowed to come to the canteen to eat if you didn't work a certain amount. You work a certain amount, you get your tokens or whatever, you can bring them to the canteen. It's the sick, the elderly, pregnant women, didn't matter. If you weren't able to work, you didn't get your money for food. Millions of people starved. So I'm sorry you were making a humorous example, and I just took it to a dark
relevant,
place.
But that one is not necessarily, unless that government was reacting to a famine and saying, it sounds like they created a problem. They created the famine through these policies. It's not just that they were reflecting.
Yes, he consciously created Mao created a famine that killed tens of millions of people, or is it 20 or 30? I'm not sure, but anyway, all right. Shall I keep going?
Yeah.
This proposition derives its force from something that is both true and important, but the phrase itself remains a piece of political claptrap. The phrase itself.
In other words, some must be restrained so that others can be free.
Okay. It is true. So that's surprising. All right. It is true that to offer political rights or safeguards against intervention by the state to men who are half naked, illiterate, underfed, and diseased is to mock their condition. They need medical help or education before they can understand or make use of an increase in their freedom. What is freedom to those who cannot make use of it? So this is just everything we've been talking about.
Yep.
Without adequate conditions for the use of freedom, what is the value of freedom? For things come first. There are situations
First
things come first. There are situations, as a 19th century Russian radical writer declared, in which boots are superior to the works of Shakespeare. I think that was Lenin. Individual freedom is not everyone's primary need. I'm sure someone's going to correct me because I probably got that wrong. So if it's not Lenin, let us know. For freedom is not the mere absence of frustration of whatever kind. This would inflate the meaning of the word until it meant too much or too little. The Egyptian peasant needs clothes or medicine before and more than personal liberty, but the minimum freedom that he needs today and the greater degree of freedom that he may need tomorrow is not some species of freedom peculiar to him, but identical with that of professors, artists, and millionaires. Okay.
So he was not saying something as I was trying to maybe sketch some relativism based on the particular environment of what sort of freedom and how much government interference, how much protection is required. But he seems to be making a much more modest point of you got to go over these humps. And then freedom is pretty much going to be the same for every society, right? The freedoms that people should have is going to be the same for pretty much any society. And for everybody, it's also the case that they have to get over these initial humps of being able, of having their basic needs taken care of in some way, whether they can do it themselves or it has to be provided for them before any of this is even an issue. So the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, basically.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's not that we are going to say that liberty at some fundamental level varies with the conditions of the society, whether people have enough or not. It's the same for millionaires, professors, and artists at a fundamental level. But he's saying, yes, he's acknowledging the fact that if your needs are not met, then you're not able to exercise that liberty. All right, you want to go ahead?
What troubles the consciences of Western liberals is not, I think, the belief that the freedom that men seek differs according to their social or economic conditions, but that the minority who possess it have gained it by exploiting, or at least averting their gaze from, the vast majority who do not. They believe, with good reason, that if individual liberty is an ultimate end for human beings, none should be deprived of it by others, least of all that some should enjoy it at the expense of others. Equality of liberty, not to treat others as I should not wish them to treat me, repayment of my debt to those who alone have made possible my liberty or prosperity or enlightenment, justice in its simplest and most universal sense, these are the foundations of liberal morality. Liberty is not the only goal of men. I can, like the Russian critic Belinsky, say that if others are to be deprived of it, if my brothers are to remain in poverty, squalor, and chains, then I do not want it for myself. I reject it with both hands and infinitely prefer to share their fate. But nothing is gained by a confusion of terms. To avoid glaring inequality or widespread misery, I am ready to sacrifice some or all of my freedom. I may do so willingly and freely, but it is freedom that I am giving up for the sake of justice or equality or the love of my fellow men. I should be guilt-stricken, and rightly so, if I were not, in some circumstances, ready to make this sacrifice. But a sacrifice is not an increase in what is being sacrificed, namely freedom, however great the moral need or the compensation for it. Everything is what it is. Liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness or justice or culture or human happiness or a quiet conscience. If the liberty of myself or my class or nation depends on the misery of a number of other human beings, the system which promotes this is unjust and immoral. But if I curtail or lose my freedom in order to lessen the shame of such inequality, and do not thereby materially increase the individual liberty of others, an absolute loss of liberty occurs. This may be compensated for by a gain in justice or in happiness or in peace, for the loss remains, and it is a confusion of values to say that although my liberal individual freedom may go by the board, some other kind of freedom, social or economic, is increased. Yet it remains true that the freedom of some must at some times be curtailed to secure the freedom of others. Upon what principle should this be done? If freedom is a sacred, untouchable value, there can be no such principle. One or other of these conflicting rules or principles must, at any rate, or in practice, yield. Not always for reasons which can be clearly stated, let alone generalized into rules or universal maxims. Still, a practical compromise has to be found.
Okay. So it gets a little bit complicated, I think, towards the end. I mean, I think the point is well taken in the beginning, which is that when we talk about the trade-offs between freedom and the flourishing of a society, freedom and equality, in a sense, freedom and people having enough. He wants us to reject this idea that somehow we're balancing two types of freedom, right? He's saying that, yes, just because having enough is a precondition of the exercise of our freedom doesn't mean that that's a type of freedom. And it doesn't mean when we try to establish a utopian state by, let's say, in an authoritarian society where people's individual liberties are suppressed, that we're just making a trade-off between the liberty of, say, free expression and the liberty of a society in which everyone is economically equal, let's say. Those are not actually two types of freedom. You got freedom on the one side, and then on the other, you have these other values, such as what? Culture. What are the ones he lists? Justice, fairness, equality, fairness, justice, culture. So those are that's the trade-off, and you can't. It's not all just reducible to units of freedom. Freedom on one side, and then freedom on the other. So I think that point is well taken. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this sounds like an argument that we shouldn't admit a notion of positive freedom, that it should only be this negative freedom. And we should just call power, what I was calling positive freedom, we should just call it power. We should call it abilities. We should, say that there are issues of justice relevant in how power is distributed, but why call it freedom? I think we might want to have this argument against Berlin, because the term freedom has as its connotation that it is the goal of a society, is to make free individuals, not equal individuals, not, so that if we want to say equality is desirable, we want to just say, well, that's a type of freedom too, right? It's freedom from being lorded over by people in a higher social class that think they're all superior to me. No, I want a truly free, unencumbered, this is why I was saying freedom is like power, because like, hey, I'm flying, I feel so free. Or the way that I can't remember which philosopher, I had gotten this from Fritjof Bergman, but the idea of feeling in your body, right? Nietzsche's Funktionslust, that like that is a real concrete feeling of freedom, of exerting power, doing something that you are able to do. I don't know. I'm not, and that's at least not totally irrelevant to the political, even though clearly it is something very different than the political. It is not something that, how is society supposed to step in and through any law encourage you to express your Funktionslust? No.
Yeah. So yeah, it's certainly not negative liberty. I don't know if that's positive liberty either. I think we'll find out. I don't know what he means by positive liberty yet. It wasn't very well defined, and there's a whole section on it coming up. But but it may have something to do with what you're talking about.
Well, can I add in one more thing, which is the Kantian positive freedom, which is just right. The ability, actually, this even comes from the ancient Greeks, right? For Plato, the tyrant seems very free, right? No one is setting in and preventing the tyrant from doing anything, but the tyrant is a slave to his desires. So internally, he's not free. So again, not completely relevant to politics, but Plato certainly thought it was worth bringing up in the Republic, right? So but there's not a direct law about this. For Kant specifically, it was insofar as our reason is in control, insofar as we are free from heteronymous causes, the desires and whims and whatever, and able to sort of focus on what we should be doing according to our reason, that is freedom. I mean, is there any room for that kind of talk? Right.
We have to distinguish political liberty from free will. You're making me think here, well, how are they related? That's a big question, in the sense of there's no freedom of the will. Well, we're all determined anyway. But I think I think it's not unrelated to this idea, right, that there may be determining factors in society that are so strong that they prevent us from exercising our political liberty. That's not unrelated to the idea that if we're determinists, we don't have free will. In this case, I just wanted to, he's okay. He says liberty is liberty, not equality or fairness or justice or culture. But I see equal rights as fundamental to liberty, and probably justice as fairness. So those are usually thought of as essentially liberal ideas. Culture is a whole other thing. I don't know why that makes it in there. But so, yeah, certainly equality of natural abilities or equalities of outcomes. Today people talk about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome as the liberal conception of a society versus the more, let's say, communitarian, or however you want to put it, DEI conception of a society. But so equality is one of these words which has a dual meaning, and one of them just means equal rights, which seems very closely associated for me with liberty. So I'm a little bit confused about the distinction that he's making there. And then towards the end of this, he's told us it's claptrap, or it's a kind of truism maybe, to say that liberty depends on coercion of others. But I still don't know why he's saying that. So he says, yes, it remains true that freedom must at times be curtailed to secure the freedom of others. And then it seems to be what he has in mind is the type of curtailment that might go on in, say, an authoritarian socialist society for the sake of, something more utopian, for the sake of equality of outcomes and so on. But that's not what Mill, for instance, had in mind. What all Mill has in mind is that you have to curtail the freedom of others in order to ensure rights. Two very, very different ideas of curtailment. So I don't know what's going on here, if he's conflating those two things or what. But
well, let's see in the next was it me next? I don't remember who was reading next.
I can't remember.
I think it was you. Yeah, go ahead, go read
Right.
the rest of page 19 here.
Philosophers with an optimistic view of human nature and a belief in the possibility of harmonizing human interests, such as Locke or Adam Smith, or in some moods, Mill, believe that social harmony and progress were compatible with reserving a large area for private life over which neither the state nor any other authority must be allowed to trespass. Hobbes and those who agreed with him, especially conservative or reactionary thinkers, argued that if men were to be prevented from destroying one another and making social life into a jungle or a wilderness, greater safeguards must be instituted to keep them in their places. Okay, so he's carving out a difference between people like Hobbes and then Mill and Locke. He wished correspondingly to increase the area of centralized control and decrease that of the individual. But both sides agreed that some portion of human existence must remain independent and of the sphere of social control. To invade that preserve, however small, would be despotism. The most eloquent of all defenders of freedom and privacy, Benjamin Constant, who had not forgotten the Jacobin dictatorship, declared that at the very least the liberty of religion, opinion, expression, property must be guaranteed against arbitrary invasion. Jefferson, Burke, Paine, Mill compiled different catalogs of individual liberties, but the argument for keeping authority at bay is always substantially the same. We must preserve a minimum area of personal freedom if we are not to degrade or deny our nature. We cannot remain absolutely free and must give up some of our liberty to preserve the rest. But total self-surrender is self-defeating. What then must the minimum be? That which a man cannot give up without suffering against the essence of his human nature. Okay, he's answering it here. I was saying that like it was a question. Then what must the minimum be? that which a man cannot give up without suffering against the essence, without offending. That's why I was confused. Without offending against the essence of his human nature. Okay. What is this essence? There are standards what are the standards which it entails? This has been and perhaps always will be a matter of infinite debate. But whatever the principle in terms of which the area of non-interference is to be drawn, whether it is that of natural law or natural rights, or of utility, or the pronouncements of a categorical imperative, or the sanctity of the social contract, or any other concept which men have sought to clarify and justify their convictions, liberty in this sense means liberty from. So negative. Absence of interference beyond the shifting but always recognizable frontier. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, said the most celebrated of its champions. If this is so, is compulsion ever justified? Mill had no doubt that it was. Since justice demands that all individuals be entitled to a minimum of freedom, all other individuals were of necessity to be restrained, if need be by force, from depriving anyone of it. Okay, thing that I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode. Indeed, the whole function of law was the prevention of just such collisions. The state was reduced to what Lassalle contemptuously described as the function of a night watchman or traffic policeman.
Yeah, with the last paragraph, we spent all our time talking about freedom versus these other possible values, but the way that he ended that was, yet it remains true that the freedom of some must at times be curtailed to secure the freedom of others. Under what principle must thus be done? So that's
cannot offend against the essence of his human nature. Turns out to be.
So that's
we need a minimum that preserves the essence of his human nature. Reminds me of Spinoza a little bit, the Tractatus, which is also all about freedom and liberty, and I think it's based on the same idea. At a certain point, you're not even human anymore. Maybe 1984 is a good example of this as well, because 1984 focuses on the way in which an authoritarian society can squash even our ability to love, right? That's the one thing that Winston thought he had until the very end. You can torture someone into giving up their capacity to love, which I take it to be part of this human essence. So that's a really interesting way to think about it. I hadn't actually thought about this in terms of, we need what is it to be human? Now I'm thinking of our Aristotle metaphysics recordings that we're doing. That, in a way, gives us some guidance on what the scope of liberty is in a society.
Is there something problematic on is Berlin saying there's some issue? I think the thing that resonates very heavily with people is the doctrine, I think from Locke, is that you should have as much freedom as possible, except when your actions are going to impinge on other people. That seems very commonsensical. It seems like, to answer his own question, what is the principle for denying liberty? Well, it's liberty itself. It's when other people's liberty is going to be interfered with. Is Berlin telling us that there's something that there are problems with that on the face of it? That that if you got into specific cases, it leaves a lot underdetermined. There's a lot of room for argument, even just sort of admitting that in the abstract, or even is there something more fundamentally wrong with that than I'm implying?
Sorry, I'm not sure. Not sure what you're asking.
What you think of that, just from the point of view of, now we've read many things later in history about political science, about political philosophy, than this idea of that should be the restriction on liberty, is you get as much liberty as possible unless your actions are going to interfere, impinge upon the liberty of others.
It's not quite, I don't think it's quite the standard. So we can be, it depends. I guess for Nozick, right? Even taxation was unjust. I can't remember, but I think we might say, right, the government can coerce you to pay taxes. And if the principle is the one that Berlin is describing here, that it not offend against the essence of your human nature, I think we could say that that type of coercion is not too great an infringement on liberty. Yes, I think many of the forms of coercion, right, are just there's a law against, again, me going out and killing someone willy-nilly. That's coercion. That's an infringement on my liberty, but it's necessary for the liberty of the other person. And it's the type of thing that you're pointing to, Mark, but I think he may be giving us a slightly different standard, right? When he talks about this human nature.
Yes. Okay. So the human nature thing is a response to, if you just say, oh, we should allow you as much freedom as possible unless you start impinging on the liberty of others. Well, what constitutes an impingement? What constitutes an illegitimate impingement? If it's any impingement at all, then it's going to be really hard to, I'm just trying to think. So I can't then elect a government to tax you because that would be impinging on your liberty, right? Because taxation is basically a theft of part of your time, says Nozick, or says Murray Rothbard, whoever your extreme libertarian is. Whereas most of us would say, or Berlin's characterization was, does the taxation, if it's such a burden that it's like, Sheriff of Nottingham pounding on the peasants' doors of like, give me your last coppers, that actually would impinge on your liberty. But the kind of stuff that we're talking about, 10% of your income or whatever, is low enough that it's not actually going to count as an impingement on your dignity, certainly, and therefore your liberty.
Man, if only it were 10%. It's interesting. I saw something about some civil war, which started over taxation. It's interesting how common taxation is a source of strife, historically in societies, including major wars and things like that, or major civil conflict. But yeah, I mean, I think you were making me think. Yeah, so coercion or impingement, it's different when the government does it, obviously, than when individuals do it. So I can't tax you, obviously, but we can set up a governmental authority for taxation. So I just wanted to bookmark that when we think about this concept of impingement. All right. Anything else before we?
Yeah, unfortunately, we still have multiple pages left, even of the negative liberty section. But I think this was it's a little different in that his text is not actually, his diction is not difficult compared to everything else we've read. We're not having to really stress over what he means by this sentence so often, but certainly we have a lot of opinions in this area. So at least for another few parts, it should be.
Well, we've read 5 pages. We have 10 pages left. It's, it's not I guess getting through 10 pages is not likely in one more recording, but it's not entirely impossible given we've done a lot of legwork in the first episode. But we'll see. I think, it's fine. 1 to 2 more recordings on this, we'll get it. So.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So
Bye.
long.